Okay, so this is going to be a super self-indulgent meeting in part because basically every 2 to 3 weeks, I do something like this, which is I call Lukas. I have a list of questions and problems with the world, and I call him on the phone, and he talks to me for about 30 to 40 minutes. And then I feel like I've made a little bit of progress, or I feel even more terrified about the world. And that's in part because Lukas has been probably one of the most important entrepreneurs in the middle of figuring out what machine learning and artificial intelligence is going to look like. He was seminal in a number of like fairly important businesses that defined, in some ways, the structure of how to think about this industry. And so, starting with Powerset, which was this failed search engine that he was an engineer at, to CrowdFlower, which was one of the first microtask or annotation companies, over to it getting acquired by Appen, over to like sort of interning at OpenAI and sort of like spending some time doing kooky things with them, and then realizing that there were actually interesting both tools and needs and opportunities and then deciding to start weights and biases, and then getting acquired by CoreWeave and now being a key part of CoreWeave. And I think in that arc, you basically see a bunch of small decisions and hard calls around what this industry is going to look like. And in that, I think we get tastes of what like AI really is like. And so what I'd really love to do is I'd love to talk a little bit about maybe initially some of those moments, even starting back with Powerset and then using that in some ways to build up to what you're thinking about next, right? And so there's a way in which like Powerset, I don't know, what was Powerset and how'd you end up there?
Well, so I was trying to be an academic researching machine learning. I was pretty bad at it. I found it kind of boring because the applications felt so contrived.
Hmm.
This is back in like 2000, 2005, and so I went to PowerSet, which was like a company that was trying to do like search with semantic search. Actually, I mean it's a lot like what GPT can do now, or Perplexity is kind of what we were hoping that it would do. And I was actually in charge of. It's funny, even back then, like 2005, 2006, I was in charge of actually doing the evals, for the search engine. And I was basically just seeing that it wasn't working well. It's funny. The vibes are good, actually. It had some like really good examples where it would, do impressive things. But I think like a lot of things when you actually just benchmarked it with like random examples of things that you might ask, you'd get bad results.
And I think that disconnect between what the hopes are and what are the actualities, I think there's a way in which like one of your strengths is that you're honest about it, right? I think notoriously you were captured, I think on even on video, but at least in a quote saying, "Hey, gosh, I don't know if this thing will actually work."
Yeah.
And everyone looked at you, and everyone looked at you. Okay, and then talk a little bit about what was the importance then of something like Crowdflower? What was that, and what was the right way to think about that?
So, CrowdFlower, you would know it now as this pains me to describe it like this, but it was like an early scale AI, if you've heard of that company. The genesis for me was noticing actually when I was briefly working in research that all the interesting problems that you could work on just happened to be ones where there happened to be like a data set available. I think Peter Norvig talked about this a long time ago of like, kind of where AI is working is where there's, data sets available. And so what I was thinking was, okay, if we could use annotators to kind of create data sets
Not machines. What are annotators
like
again?
humans. Yeah. So it's just like, Mechanical Turk like launched, around the same time. We sort of helped, Mechanical Turk with quality, also kind of at our own sets of annotators, and worked with a lot of the AI companies that were kind of forming at the time. There's sort of a wave of like, companies doing natural language types of things. This is like before, OpenAI GPT. This is more like, like the Bloombergs of the world, trying to kind of like, parse information in much more simple ways and structure data. And then kind of along came self-driving cars, and that was like a really like, economically important example where you want to just label, or the first thing you want to do is label images the car is seeing with, is there a pedestrian there?
Right.
Uh,
And I think to me, what's interesting is like from the policy point of view, or the economic point of view, or the research point of view, these are all abstract things. But for people actually running businesses, they're very concrete, right? That you were looking for specific commercial opportunities, and then like you had to make a switch, or you had to decide to go after that. And so like think of like for a second, talk a little bit about like how something like the autonomous vehicle image annotation thing, like how does that come about? How do you pay attention? And then how do you decide to go after it?
Well, how does that happen? I mean, we were out there trying to, make the business work, and this was, starting in like 2008, 2009, and we're like, okay, like what kind of annotation do people need? So we're like looking around, at different use cases and where, people are asking for annotations. The self-driving car case must have been like around 2015. We started to see, just tons and tons of requests and interest in, labeling pixels. So it kind of just came in. It was actually, I remember it was an interesting decision of like how much do we want to focus on, self-driving cars at that time. I think, actually one of the things that Scale did really well at that time. It's funny, they were like, I remember the two co-founders coming into my office, and talking to me and started telling me they were gonna, basically telling me they were gonna do this,
Right, right.
and weirdly asking me for my help, even though it was like obviously a competitive, product. And we were like, okay, like we should build tools to make it, you know, more easy to annotate, um, images for self-driving cars. And what kind of shocked us though, like at that time, and I think you've seen a couple iterations of this. It felt like, okay, how many self-driving car companies could there be? Like, how many different companies are really gonna, invest billions of dollars in trying to make their own, um, self-driving system? And you saw this like explosion of like, big companies doing it, startups doing it. It just felt like, okay, this must be a bubble. These things are overfunded. How, like, there's really not going to be that many self-driving, technology. So you saw this kind of explosion, and then you kind of saw this purge. I think we kind of saw that again, or maybe we're seeing it with, foundation models.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So let me just quickly finish like the little history of things because I think it is those markers are really interesting because after you sold CrowdFlower to Appen and then took some time off, it did give you a chance to actually think about the world in general. Sort of, and I think this is like an interesting thing for a bunch of folks. When you did that, you could have taken a bunch of you could have gone around the world. You could have like, I don't know, do all these fun things. But instead, what did you end up deciding to do after you're done playing with little robots in your garage? What was the thing you did after that?
Um, it's funny. I just don't know who I'm like wondering who I'm talking to here. Like it's like I put my name. I feel like everybody else had a like description of what they're going to talk about. I put my name, and you all show up. My dad is here, which is awesome. And Tim, so I appreciate that, and Tim. But like, I'm curious. Is this like a technical audience or a policy audience? What it technical? Yeah, obviously technical. Yeah. Oh, Roy. Hey, man. All right.
Actually, that's a fair question. I should have done that. Who's in policy world? Raise your hand. Okay, who's in like tech world? Raise your hand.
Interesting.
Okay.
Okay. Well,
Okay, so here you are. You're like you've sold a company, you've made some money. You like this is, and then you're like you're playing with little robots in your garage, and you decide you should do something else.
yeah.
You're literally playing with little robots in your garage, right? And then sort of
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's a funny experience. I mean, that I was having. I remember when I was actually in my first job at Powerset, I was looking at an older generation of AI researchers, who had kind of come from like a more rule-based system instead of, the probabilistic stuff. And I was just judging them like so hard. Like I was like, you guys are morons. Like, I can't believe you didn't like stay up with the times. Like, I just don't even want to like listen to you. It's just like embarrassing. You're like, 35 and you have like nothing to like offer. Um, and then and then I was 35, and I was like, I really like love AI research, and I realized I had sort of like a lot of assumptions that I had. Like, at the time I was like, okay, data is like the only thing that matters. Like, compute doesn't matter that much. People would always come to you in the 2000s with like, here's like a new model that's better, and it always wasn't better. Like, it was always like they were fooling themselves. And so I had these instincts, and it was like, wait, these instincts are actually kind of wrong. Like, deep learning like is actually working better. Like, that skepticism is wrong. Like, compute matters. And then I was seeing like these breakthroughs that I really cared about. Like when I was a kid, I loved to play Go. I was always thinking about like how to like that might have been one of the first reasons I got into AI. I was like wanting to think about how to computer win at Go. And I saw like suddenly like you know, AI is better at Go than people. And like that was like astonishing because it was actually happening like faster than I predicted. So I was feeling like, okay, I have gotten like so deeply like untechnical. This is just like really embarrassing. So I started started actually, yeah, like building robots for some reason. And then I had a friend actually, Bob McGrew, who was, he's running like a 1,000-person team at Palantir, and he went and became an intern at OpenAI. And I was just like so inspired by that because he was like a smart guy. So I was like, look, I want to do this too. So I went to OpenAI and I asked him like, hey, would you like basically like let me be an intern? Like you don't have to pay me, just like give me like whatever tasks you don't want to do. And that was actually really helpful for me because it kind of got me back in a flow of like working. Um, 2017, I think. I mean, it was open as a smaller if they let me do that, which like I think that was like the very end of it. It was like maybe 20 people in that like old Stripe building. Um, but it was like it's pretty cool because at the time it was like, it was like really idealistic, and it was amazing because it was all these different levels of famousness in this building, like like super like well known professors and like completely like new like undergrads. But I think what they all had in common was like they didn't really want to write papers; they wanted to like ship stuff, and they also thought they could, so they wanted to like. It's all these people that were kind of willing to just give up their credentials because no one cared and try to like get something out the door. So I found that environment, it's super inspiring. And the other thing that I noticed in doing that was like, there's so many kind of like missing tools. Like I, had this boss that was actually like a 25-year-old, and like, and he, like, I wanted to show him what I was doing. Like I wanted to show him like, okay, here's like, kind of my loss curves that are happening. Like here's actually some examples of like, what my like, image classifier, how it's performing. And it's actually kind of hard to like show him like what
Hmm.
my models were doing. And so that was like really basic. And so that was kind of the genesis of I started building like kind of tools, for myself, to just do the job there. Started having this a collection of like smaller tools. And then unfortunately I was like, okay, well, I want to start a company again.
Yeah,
Work
and then
on this.
maybe tell us just a little bit about like more about what it felt like. Why did you decide to work at OpenAI versus other places, and what attracted you at that point in time?
Well, I mean, one was like they were kind of small enough that they were like willing to let me. I didn't really want to like commit to a job. I just sold a company, and so like I felt a little embarrassed to just be like, hey, can I be an individual contributor, like engineer? Like I thought I might be like bad at it, So it sort of felt like, OpenAI was like small enough that they kind of let me dabble in that and try it, but then also they had so much ambition that it felt like they actually were kind of working on like newer things, like
Right.
where I felt like probably Google was doing that, but they would never let me do it. And I didn't. There weren't that many companies that felt like at that time they're really in the forefront of like, this is like pretty basic. It's like, can you get a GPU to run, you know, TensorFlow at the time?
Right. Right. Right.
There didn't seem like there were that many people actually really doing anything there.
Okay, and then so what is the first version of weights and biases, and why was that important?
Um, well, the first version of Weights and Biases was it's basically like there's a product called TensorBoard that kind of let you see how your models are doing, keep track of like, are they improving? And there's, a lot of reasons you want to do that. It sounds like some of you maybe have used it, maybe train models, but like, you want to, see like, okay, is my model improving? And there's like improving is a complicated question. So you have like a lot of different charts and graphs of like, are they improving, getting worse? And then you also want to kind of collaborate on like, I'm trying all these different things and I want to write down like, what happened in a cohesive way where I'm like showing the results, I'm like showing the code, and I'm also like putting in my own take. Um, does this make any sense?
Yeah.
I feel like I'm
Yeah,
speaking
yeah.
really
No, no.
abstractly. So
But there's a way to me that like what's interesting about it is on the one hand, it was not that complicated. On the other hand, it was super strategic and like it was just such a nice entry point that now seems obvious because so many people used it. And then at the time did not seem obvious. And I think there's a way in which you somehow, for whatever reason, saw around corners more clearly than other people.
well,
Why is that?
there's a really specific reason for that actually. So when I was at Powerset, a guy worked for me and lived with my co-founder, Tom Warner, who's one of the founders of GitHub, and Chris Wansdorf was around. So we actually watched GitHub, get founded on my co-founder's couch. And it was like really interesting because like, we were all kind of playing around with startups and like we were sort of like, GitHub, is this a good idea? I mean, it's funny now, but at the time it was like, okay, this is a developer tool. Developers never pay for anything.
It's a thin wrapper on top of Git. How valuable could it be?
And like, what does even Git? Like people weren't really using that. And like, there's so many reasons it seemed like a bad idea, even to us. It even seemed like a bad idea to them. Like, so they were actually like kind of working on this as a passion project, but they had this other like really stupid idea that they were like doing at the same time. They thought, okay, this is how we're gonna make money, and like GitHub is the way that we're gonna that we just want to make this.
Uh-huh.
And then they had like so much fun, right? Because like it took off. Like engineers were like making money, like getting more and more important inside of companies. Companies felt like that IP was valuable. They were just on these like perfect trends of like developers mattering inside companies with this thing that kind of functioned as a system of record for these developers. So I was thinking, okay, these AI engineers or ML engineers, as they were called 2 years ago,
Sure. Sure.
they
A long
are
time
like,
ago.
yeah. Um, you know, it's funny, at the time, it was like, "Whoa, they're starting to get paid, like, $300,000 a year, $400,000. That's amazing, right?" And, like, there's not that many companies there or, like, inside a company, I felt like engineers were valuable because they do automation, but then AI engineers are automating the automation, so that's gonna be, like, everything that's true about engineers, we're gonna see that, like, doubly exponential on, like, AI engineers. And so, the my thinking was like, "Okay, like, we should make, like, a GitHub-like thing, um, for these AI engineers specifically." It seems like too little a market, but, we could do the same thing that GitHub did. And also, I think the other thing was, like, watching GitHub have, like they were having, like, so much fun in the early days, right? Because they made a tool that, like, developers, like, really loved, and they, like, went right to the developers. The same thing where, like, the OpenAI people were, like, our friends, the Anthropic people were friends, like, we wanted to this was before Anthropic, I guess, but, like, these were all our friends, and so we wanted to make tools or I wanted to make tools they'd actually like,
Right.
but it also felt, like, economically viable. So it was actually, yeah, it was, like, a really specific plan that we had
Yeah.
because we'd, like, literally seen
The playbook.
the playbook once. Yeah,
Right.
very closely, yeah.
And then when you start then looking, sort of obviously in over the life of weights and biases, there's like sort of a few huge changes that you guys had to think about and navigate in a way in which like the market just dramatically expanded in size, both in terms of initially going from computer vision centric to like sort of LLM centric, but also from like a broader set of folks who are making models, so broad set of folks using models. Like walk
Yeah.
us through that.
Okay, yeah, so the first one was, like, basically, I think, distributed compute. And that one we, like, nailed, right? So at the time, there were, like, a bunch of different tools out there, and everyone was kinda talking about distributed computation, but, like or distributed training, but it's funny to think no one was doing it. It was, like, too complicated to get your, it was too complicated to train models on, like, more than one computer at a time. Like, it was really, really hard
Mhm.
to do it. And so very few were doing it, but we were like, we're gonna support this use case really well. And honestly, the real reason that we support the use case well, my co-founder was really like, "This is the future." But I was just like, "Man, I really like the OpenAI guys, and I wanna, like, impress them."
Sure.
And so it was like, just like, "Okay, like, let's just make it work for these one." We had this peop and so OpenAI was, like, out in front doing it, and they kinda pulled us along.
Right.
So that was, like, I think that really, really helped us. Then I think one where we, like, kind of didn't adapt, the other big change was basically in about 2023, like, GPT 3.5 comes out, and now, a lot of things that you would have done by building your own model, now you just wanna use, GPT 3.5, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of those use cases now that you would have had your own in-house, like, AI team, like, building something. Now, like, software developers can use GPT as, like, an API to do that. So it is, like, a massive market expansion. Like, suddenly, there's, like, all these, like, it's a lot cheaper to do these things, easier to do these things, but, like, the users fundamentally changed. And, like, we named our company Weights and Biases, right? Like, it was, like I remember, like, we were, like, um I remember, like,
Wait, what does that mean when you said you called it weights and biases? What is the weight and what is the bias in the linear algebra?
Yeah, yeah, and like a regression or a neural net was, like, what we're thinking, right? So, like, they're like the coefficients in the equation of a regression or neural net are called the weights and biases. But, like
It's a super specific inside joke that almost nobody gets, except for the people in the middle of it, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
so yeah.
totally. And in fact, people, like, hated the name. I mean, it was, like, crazy, like, we had engineers that were like, I was, like, almost, like, not gonna reply to your job posting because the name was, like, so stupid. And it's the sorting yeah, it's a sorting hat, but it wasn't sorting perfectly at the time. Like, so I really felt like worried about it because, like, I wanted to be successful when I was attached to a name, but, like, there were people like, would say, like, everybody's worried about, like, bias in AI. Like, you putting bias in your name, are you, like, insane? Like, um, but, I wanted to make this point that, like, it was sort of like the strategy of the company was contained in the name. It was like, look, I want to be on the side of um, ML engineers. Like, I want to make a company that's for ML engineers, and they'll understand what this name means. And it's fine if nobody else understands what the name means. It's almost better if they, like, hate this name, but, like, our core audience will, like, love this name. That's what I was really thinking. But even some ML engineers like stupid names. So I don't know. But now it's like then you get to a point where, like, I think you imbue the name with your brand, and, like, a lot of people, or maybe where I'm just, like, more successful or more something, and people don't usually come up to me and tell me they hate the name anymore. But the but we kind of had this crisis where now most people doing AI don't actually know what the name weights and biases means, right? Because it's, like, actually, like, mostly, like, software engineers, and they're familiar. And it's funny, another thing that worked for weights and biases was like, my co-founders always make fun of me, like, Lucas, you like are so stupid. Like the way you use Git is you just like randomly like type like Git commands, and you just like leave it, you leave everything like this huge mess. And it's funny because now they joke that that's like what GPT does when you ask what to. But
True, true, true.
they're like you like fundamentally don't understand how Git works. I'm like, man, I really do not understand how Git works. But but I think that like works. I think a lot of ML engineers don't actually fundamentally understand how Git works. So that works. But now we're like working with software, but now it's like our new audience for this democratization is software engineers. So they do actually know how understand how Git works. They don't like understand typically like what way the name weights and biases
Yeah.
is. And so, we had to come out with with new products that serve this market. That was like just and then there's like subtle details like that that really matter. And we're a tool company. So we try to make like really good UIs and like have like really deep like empathy, with our users. Like all we are, like people always are like, oh, like Lucas, your stuff is like so simple. Like people are always like, yeah, I could like make that in like a weekend, and it's kind of like, you kind of could, like, you could make a shitty version of what we do in a weekend, unlike a lot of other products out there, right? But it's like, we put a lot of care in making it good through like a real connection with our users and like thinking about like what they would want. And because literally all we do is like we produce a bunch of graphs for you. You know what I mean? Like, like every
But very specific graphs that
very
people
specific
care about.
graphs.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's like, it's a technical audience. Like any BI tool could produce these graphs, any graphing library could produce these graphs. Like, and um, but the graphs are good because we spend so much time, with our customers making them good. But now the customers change. So it's like actually it's like software developers don't love graphs as much as ML engineers, right? They're not as trained in statistics, right? They're like they don't like if you talk about like standard error, it kind of freaks them out, right? And so, yeah, so that was a second, I think, like, kind of existential crisis, which was much tougher for us to navigate. We've built new products that I feel, really proud of, and the market's a lot bigger. But I think in the new world, if we're honest with ourselves, with like the AI engineers, we're not like market dominating in the way we are with like, ML engineers. Like I think like most people who are trained to model, they know the product, weights and biases. They actually love the product weights and biases, right? But I think the AI engineers were still, still working on that, and
So now I'll transition now to talk a little bit about like your view of the outside world, and then we can talk about the future. Now, so now you saw like that whole wave of autonomous vehicle companies, and then now you saw a whole wave of foundation model companies. Talk about the compare and contrast. Sort of talk to me about how you feel the dynamics will play out over the next, sort of whatever, few
sure.
years.
Well, look, I mean, I think making a great foundation model and making a great self-driving car, they're kind of similar in that, the prize is like really huge and it's like a really expensive, technical undertaking, right? Where most of the risk is like technical. And I think that's like catnip to like investors, right? It's like, it's obviously this like, massive, interesting market. Um, and it also doesn't seem like you would really want to have like 100 different takes on self-driving cars, but there probably were. Like I remember when we started, we thought like, okay, what could the size of the self-driving car market be? It could be like, okay, maybe there'll be like four or like six or what, and then there's like 100. And I think you see it with like, you see, like, there's so many people that are trying to build different versions of foundation models now, despite the fact that a lot of these are like open source and very open, right?
Right.
But it's also the same dynamics where people are in like this huge rush, which is great for like vendors,
Mhm.
so like, like that, like we were doing these like labeling tasks back in the day for like a lot of like kind of cost saving stuff, right? Where it's like somebody's like, okay, I just want to like my structured data so I can like run some business process like a little bit better. And it's like people would just like fight you on like pennies, and so that was like the beginning until self-driving cars came along. And then the negotiations just were like so different with these companies of like, okay, if you can like deploy this a month faster, like I'll, pay you a lot more money, right? And I mean, this is obvious. I think like probably like from a VC lens, of course, there's that dynamic. But look, when you're inside it, you really like
Well, you feel, I mean, from the VC point of view, there's like, oh, there's this pot of gold. And then on the other part of the dynamic, though, is like what you feel is like, oh, suddenly these companies are in a rush to actually try to get the thing out or get it to work. And I guess, sort of in foundation model world, like sort of how does that dynamic play out from what when you talk to them or
Well, look at the same thing. I mean, it's astonishing. Like I don't think people actually realize how much the new job. I think, one of the things that happened to me as like a labeling company is, we got tons of lawsuits, we got like, beaten up in the press. So like, I think every labeling company after us learned to keep like an incredibly low profile.
That's right.
Seriously. And so, people don't know about the next, kind of cohort of labeling companies. They don't actually know how well they're doing. And they're
Give
doing,
us a sense. Give us a sense. What
uh,
and what do they do?
okay.
Yeah.
So these, even now, right? These LLMs right? Like any LLM is trained with a ton of human annotated data, right? And it's basically like examples of what you want it to do, right? Because LLMs are first trained on like human language, right? So they can like predict the next token, essentially like predict the next letter, right? But then you don't want them to just like, you know, be the average of like human text. Like you want them to do specific things, right? So they, set up scenarios where humans do the things that you want the LLMs to do essentially, right? And this could be like, somebody's asking like, give me a recipe, and you kind of helpfully, give a recipe, or like somebody, doesn't ask a question quite right, and you kind of try to like, nudge it to do the thing you want, or like, like literally it'll be like, okay, like prove a math problem in a way that's like, useful for a user. Many, many variations, but roughly it's like they're trying to get examples of like what you'd actually want your chat system to do,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
This is an enormous market, right? I mean, like there's a company called Surge that probably none of you have heard of. It's like $1 billion in over $1 billion in revenue, like 5 years in, never raised any money, right? And that's just one of like a ton of these companies, right? So the budgets for compute are also enormous here, like, but the budgets for labeling are similar.
Yeah. Yeah. And then when you look at that, how do you think about that from the point of view, like, are you optimistic or not optimistic about sort of this is the right direction to solve AI problems?
Um, well, look, I think it's like a technical question of like, like does scaling up compute, does scaling up labeling, like does that, continue to show improvement? My perspective is that, it always has,
Yeah.
right? So I think if you zoom out, like adding compute and adding labels has always made AI systems improve. And so I think it would be surprising if that trend stopped, but it could. I think that, like within these trends, you see a little bit of like, variation, and, people complain like, oh, this new model, maybe it's not like quite as good. But I think, I don't know. I think if you zoom out, it seems to me like, every time you increase the order of magnitude of labels, increase the order of magnitude of compute in almost any domain, you get significantly better results. And so I think people will keep trying it until it stops.
Okay, so and then if you're friends with the executives at all these big companies, like what do you think the rest of the world doesn't like? What do you think the policy people don't understand about them?
You probably that question. I was thinking about it. And I think okay. So first of all, it's sort of like asking like, what's an entrepreneur like? And I do think there's like some similarities, but mostly it's like people, right? They're like different.
Yeah.
Like I think people, you know, um, and I think I'm like so in the world, in this world that maybe I'm not totally a good person to answer like what's surprising, about these people. I think like, we're all, I think like optimistic about technology working.
Hmm.
I think people are like sincerely trying to like, figure out how to make their software work better. I mean, that might be obvious, right? But that's like the main thing that, they're like, everybody's like thinking about. Like, I think there's a lot of like sense of like there's something nefarious going on, or like, people are like full of shit. But I don't know. I think people in general, like people sort of like uh public personas in the AI industry is actually like a pretty honest reflection of themselves. Like I feel like if you go back 10 years ago and you look at like how people like show up in the media, the people that I knew that were like famous enough for that to happen, they were like a lot different than their public personas, because I think it was filtered through like a media.
Yeah.
But now I feel like people are mostly like producing their own content that's like going out into the world. So I actually think it's like, I don't know. I think like Sam's a lot like his Twitter persona. It's
Right.
actually
Right.
pretty good, um like I hear his voice in it, and everyone else too.
There's another dynamic, I think, with both from the policy and the journalist point of view, when when there's some scandal, like certainly you guys at various points got bad press. What do you think the policy and the journalists don't get about sort of when something bad or there's bad news inside a company?
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like AI has this thing. I feel like there's like so much like poking on AI in like specific places where it goes badly that I think just like misses like everyone's like terrified, right? That like, that still that like their AI system is going to be sort of like accidentally racist on some input or like, kind of do something that's going to be embarrassing, right? And like even like, it's like okay, like um, yeah, I think like Waymo holds itself to a much higher bar than like that they maybe rationally, like should in my view. And so I think I think it's just like I think there is a sense probably from people that like don't know these companies, don't feel like connected to it, you like feel outside of it that there's something, people are like trying to like, uh, make things bad or something. But I think people are really, really trying to make things work and also like terrified of embarrassment. And I think it actually holds back a fair amount of releasing of just trying to like want to make sure that like, you can't like kind of nudge a model into doing something that's, and I think there's like an amazing amount of effort to try to get the models to do something embarrassing. It's almost like
Right.
amazing how, I mean, they will really try to not, um, there's a massive amount of effort put into making the models not embarrassing themselves,
Yeah.
and yet they still do sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Okay, then talk to me a little bit then about, sort of like now looking like where you are now, and as you look around, what are the sorts of things that you're paying attention to, in the same way that you might have paid attention to 8 years ago or 15 years ago?
I mean, well, I think that some of it is actually from being like a parent now. So like I think I feel like the whole like vibe coding thing, like whether or not people are like more efficient is interesting. It's actually really interesting. I mean, I thought meters like results that people are actually less productive is like fascinating,
Yeah.
but like honestly, I think people are I mean, I should really measure it, but I think it's obvious people are more productive, especially if they're not really good, programmers. That's interesting. But I don't know, like I like watch my kid.
How old?
She's 6, so she can't actually type, but she types through me, right? So I'm like typing with just what she tells me. And we're making video games together, and I think that is like, I mean, it's like totally disposable software, right? Like we send it to, her cousin just to like, impress him.
Yeah.
And but I don't know, it just seems like that's like actually this like massive unlock of like, okay, like what else is like, coming in that genre when you can basically like, make software, like any kind of software for free. It's just really like kind of opens up my imagination of like, what if you just wanted to make a weird game one time to impress your cousin? You know what I mean? Like, and then I think another thing that like just has my imagination going, and maybe I can't articulate exactly why this feels so compelling, but we have a 3D printer that my daughter obviously loves because it's like, every morning you basically get like a new toy, but actually the models now can actually you can basically like vibe create objects. And I think that's
I'm
just
sorry, you mean physical objects?
physical objects. Yeah. So you could say, and I think it works best for toys where you don't have like actual specifications. Works really well for my kid because it's kind of like, she's like, okay, like I want to make like Corn Man, and it's like got like arms and legs and like a guitar, and and it doesn't quite like nail it like exactly, but it's like close enough that it's like interesting, and compelling. And I sort of feel like if you like play that forward, it's like, what if I was like, I want like some physical thing in my house, like my door broke, just like get like here's a picture of it, give me something that like fixes that. And I kind of wonder, like, it sort of seems like a new way for like, AI to really like interact, like engage in our like physical world.
Hmm.
That I kind of think is coming. Like, I feel like 3D printing always seemed cool, but it really had no use cases because it's so hard to build the actual models
Right.
that she would want. But if I mean, somehow it seems like more interesting to like vibe code as an object that you then have than
Yeah.
like something on inside of your computer.
Yeah. Okay, so I've got another one or two questions, and I'll open it up for questions from everyone else in a moment. Sort of tell me then, like, what are the things that you worry about? I think you've got both sort of, interesting enough. I felt like you had both, big picture and medium picture size worries, and you should be interested in hearing your point of view about it.
Well, I mean, look, obviously, like, I think inequality increases in like tons of ways, and it's a trend exacerbated, by AI. I think like inside of AI, it's kind of I feel like there used to be the ability for kind of like lots and lots of people to kind of contribute in different ways, and now the infrastructure spend is so high, and actually like experimenting at like high amounts of infrastructure is so much more like useful than experimenting at, like the things you conclude at small amounts of infrastructure like don't often scale. And so I think that there's just not um a lot of ways for people sort of outside of the biggest companies to do, interesting, a lot of different kinds of interesting research and open. But I mean, obviously there's some that's not totally true, but I think overall, that trend is like worrying. I sort of hope that there's a more proliferation of different kinds of models.
But you're also seeing like because you're both running a company and you're talking to all the AI folks.
Yeah.
Like as you talk to your peer CEOs who are building AI things, right? Like sort of how does that feel and sort of what are the impediments of fast takeoff that you see when you're talking to them?
Well, look, I think there's like two genres of CEOs right now, right? There's like the mostly like kind of, they're like the early stage, like AI native CEOs that I think, I admire, like tend to be kind of younger, doing really interesting stuff. And I think what's hard for them is just that it's so winner take all. Like it's so even more like winner take all that was like, people are like asking for companies to go from like, to like 100 million in ARR, in like, a year, I'll see like stock, I think like already like tech was kind of hard on companies like that. And like AI has made it even more just like so extremely winner take all. Like that cohort is like stressed out. Then there's like a cohort of like kind of like my peers of people building sort of like, like SaaS companies, like useful companies at scale that like matter in the world. Um, and they're all like just like kind of terrified of the disruption that's happening them with AI. Like they'll try to I was actually thinking, I sold my company recently, so I was at like a CEO group with like a whole bunch of, successful CEOs of companies you might know, like, kind of 100 million to like $1 billion revenue. And they were all talking about, like, all the ways that they injected AI into their marketing stack and their sales stack, and I was actually feeling kinda bad, like, "Shit, like, weights and biases should be at the forefront, but we're not." But then I was thinking, all of you guys, like, I know your, like, revenue numbers, like, they're not inflecting, so,
But I'm sorry, just to say that slowly. So meaning that they are genuinely doing interesting things with artificial intelligence right now that you're like, oh, this is genuinely clever and good.
yeah.
But the output, the actual change in revenue, you don't see at all.
Yeah, and I know you don't see that at all, but it's, like, actually amazing the stuff they're doing. Like, there's a lot of innovation in just, like, the sales and marketing, stack. Like, I think go-to-market is really getting changed, by AI, and there's just, like, tons of interesting things that um, you can do, but I think probably, like, the vibe coding thing, you really I think you can't trust vibes in this, and you can't just sort of assume that, because something looks, like, incredibly compelling and productive, and you sort of solved this problem that seemed, really big, that you actually are operating more efficiently.
This is our takeaway that we like Meter and Lucas are anti-vibes.
I guess so, yeah.
Yeah. Right. I mean, I do think there's a way in which, like, on the one hand, everything's the diffusion of knowledge problem. So maybe it's just the case that it's not spread widely enough or the things that work aren't spread widely enough. It's also possible that we're not going to see it, right? I guess that's but you must be, would you look around and see for early signs of people genuinely being changed or
Look, maybe it's because I
transformation?
came up through engineering. I'm like, like more eager to throw bombs at like, the sales and marketing side of an organization. But it is like, you know, it's kind of interesting that like, I mean, companies go to market are not getting more efficient, except when it's like baked into their own, thing they're doing. And actually, if you look at, I think one thing that's just striking is if you look at these AI native companies that are newer, I think they are doing often sort of like they're doing like less innovation on the go-to-market stuff
Mhm.
than the like later stage companies, even though they're like, growing faster. It's just like they have a product that's like working. So it's like growing.
Right.
Right. Whereas like the people who are more kind of like flatlined or sort of like looking to like, get like another couple percent in growth, they really come up with like smart ideas. I'm trying to think of like, I don't know if this audience would like appreciate like how much it might matter to like, be able to like um
Sell things more for
yeah,
cheaper,
do,
right?
like, better target like, have, like, really good messaging, the individual messaging that goes out to, like, all your different, like, prospects. It seems like you could totally generate, like, individualized messages that make sense, for your audience, and people look, like, phenomenally successful in doing it, and yet I don't think that, revenue is increasing much for
Yeah, I think that's like one of the central puzzles, right? I think, if there's going to be fast takeoff, it's like I think we'll get glimpses of it sooner in other small places, and I sort of constantly look for that. And I see, you're right that you don't see it as often you think. So let me open the floor now. I realize we've got 10 minutes left for questions. Go ahead.
All right, thank you for that. You mentioned almost in passing some of the lawsuits and the negative press at CrowdFlower, and I'll be honest, I don't even remember exactly what it was. I remember vaguely something, but my question is like, what did you learn from that you did differently at Weights and Biases, and more importantly, like, given the environment today, and we've heard some of it here, but outside of the walls of this conference, some of the fears and hesitance about AI, what would you do differently right now?
I think like I really admire people that go into like messy businesses, like, where there's like a lot of humans involved, where it's like, I honestly admire companies that go into like military applications, like all the kind of controversial stuff. Like I actually have deep admiration for people that like wade into that. I think for myself though, this is not my style. Like I just like I want to make like good developer tools for developers and kind of like keep my head down. I think was my honest takeaway for myself.
So, I think on the data labeling side, but by the way, good fan of Powerset back in the day. So good shout out.
Yeah, you called it a failure, but I don't agree with it.
Well, I was in Google search at that time, and I was like, yeah, semantic search. That's gonna be a thing. So awesome work there. But the thing I try to I'm trying to kind of figure out is the data labeling is there's a massive surge, no pun intended, in all of these like companies, right? Like the whole slew of them, the usual suspects. But do you see a lasting kind of sustaining thing? Given so one theory is that okay, like you have to bootstrap, right? Like these reasoning models with a whole bunch of expert process knowledge, whether it's like low level annotation or high level. And then you're done, you're off to the races, and there's like the era of experience that just like takes care of it. The other is no, you need like just like compute, like there's like a perennial human data input. Like how do you see it?
I'm really not sure. I've been a partner. You might have a better like take on this than me. I'd be curious to ask you that question. Yeah, I mean, so like a lot of these models, they can know. It's a much easier question to be like, did I do this correctly? Than like, show me how to do this correctly, right? So like, you actually can get a lot of great results. Like, this is one of the things that DeepSeek did really well. Of like, you kind of run some answers and you have like the AI label itself, really effective, right? I mean, it's one of these things that was kind of sci-fi a few years ago. Now it's working better. The only thing I observe is that the budgets of all the hyperscalers and foundation model builders for labeling have only increased in the last year. And we know this stuff works, right? So we've been doing the, RL, AIF and stuff for a few years. And the fact that inside these companies are all buying a lot more labels tells me that the labels is working. That could change. What do you think?
My sense is that there's like a lot of the mid level and low level stuff. It just feels like it's gotta have the self learning effect kick in. But maybe it's a matter of scale, right? It's again like why you could argue like why didn't distillation work? It's just because the base model wasn't great. But like there's some parallel of that that's going to happen in a few years.
Actually, I was talking, I do have a podcast that I could.
Oh yeah, what's the podcast called?
Gradient Descent, where I kind of try to go deep on people on these topics, and I do have some of the CEOs of data labeling companies on there, and the foundation labs too. But one thing, okay, I'll tell you like so like for example, code is the ultimate one where it's easy to check, right? So it's like I've written some code and I run it. I can kind of say did I get the right answer or not? Like does the code even work? However, like writing like high quality code is really really hard to check, and so that's so you get this phenomenon clearly like with all these you know coding agents that come out where they write pretty crappy code, but it does indeed work. But so I think what happened is the coding is like working, right? So I think actually the coding working has caused companies to massively increase their desire to get labelers where the labelers are trying to write high quality code, right? Because you can't actually automate that like piece of it. So again, it's like it's hard to know a priori what's going to happen.
So we're increasingly seeing tech CEOs being pulled into matters of policy and geopolitics, like, being invited to the UK to have dinner with the king. I'm curious to hear your thoughts and observations on this because from what you shared, a lot of your peer CEOs are also just like really focused on shipping good products, but now they're drawn into all of this. What are your thoughts? Thank you.
I feel like a lot of my peers they'll kind of go into policy for a little bit of time and sort of realize how horrible it is and then sort of back off, from it. Like I think it's um I think everybody honestly, I do think my peer group CEOs would really like to kind of help with policy, but I think it's like first of all it's kind of unclear, especially in AI, what good policy would be. And I think there's like really a like only downside, I think, for like wading into policy as a CEO. It's like, your employees are like watching you. They have like different opinions. Like, like, yeah, that causes like trouble like inside your own organization in a way that's not helpful. And I don't think like policymakers really want to listen to CEOs very much. Like I almost think like, tech might do better like keeping its head down and shutting up than, even trying to like, push on policy. Because it sort of seems like the backlash against tech is so strong that almost anything tech is saying, like people might just want to go the opposite direction. That was really off the cuff. I don't know.
No,
I
no,
mean, I know you guys are into it.
no. I think that's fair. I think that's fair. Um, other questions, Tim?
I'm just sort of curious. You kind of talked about how obviously there were 100 self-driving car companies and it kind of collapsed down to a much smaller number. You think the same thing will happen to the model creators because of the capital barriers. But usually when that happens, something else is happening up the stack. And so a lot of what I've been trying to think about is what is up the stack now? And I have a session tomorrow called AI and the Architecture of Participation. How do we design an AI ecosystem that makes it possible for things to be up the stack? But do you see any ideas of what that is? I mean, certainly there's one kind of application, which is, if you look at the companies that are making money in AI, it's OpenAI, just revenue, not profit. OpenAI, Anthropic. But then number 3, I think, is I don't know if it's Cursor or Replit. We've got 11 Labs, we've got Cursor. So there are companies with hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue that are not foundation model companies, and that's one kind. And they're really basically building like an application on top of this platform. But what else is there besides just these obvious application areas?
I love these questions where it's like it's a question I might ask you, Tim. I don't know. So, uh,
Well, I have some thoughts, but
um, look, I guess it seems to me like lately there have been in some areas there's been enough models available, and there seems to be a real desire to. I mean, this may change with Meta, but there's a lot of people giving away similar quality models, for free for a lot of applications. That it sort of leaves room for, like application layers to have more power, right? Like I definitely have more, of a relationship with, uh, Cursor. Not really. They I think increasingly try to obfuscate like what model is getting run, underneath. And I think like that probably prompted, Claude Code and like Codex, where they're trying to like kind of own the relationship, with the user there. So it seems like the foundation model builders, they're acting like it's important to own the important, applications as well, and not just sort of like leave it in the hands
sure.
of wrappers. So I don't know. I think I think I would probably agree with you that kind of over time, more the value starts to accrue higher in the stack, or the person that has the company that has the real connection with the user does well. But obviously, GPT and Claude are kind of like household, names at this point. So in a way, they've kind of nailed a really important application of their technology. But I'll come to your talk and learn that.
Well, I'm hoping actually to learn from the audience in it, but I'm going to try to create a framing provocation.
Nice.
I think we have one last question.
First of all, thank you for this open talk. Really, really interesting. I really like whites and biases. I think it's a beautiful name. So I want to push back a little bit on the policy thing. I have a lot of sympathy with policy sucks, and I've been doing policy all my professional career. I want to get out of it. So doing a startup now, very late, but but on the policy side, because there's this we don't know the AI policy, what this should be, and there's lots of discussions. There's lots of new organizations that are built to precisely figure this out. There's like in this space, you're confronted with so many other policies that are just like very fundamental, like data access, like governments wanting to know what's in the conversations, privacy, IP. So it's a much larger discussion than only AI policy, right? So you have to deal with or labor when you think about labeling. So isn't there something for entrepreneurs to think about as well? Like you have due diligence frameworks for big enterprises, but now these smaller companies have this huge impact. Wouldn't that be like when you start something that should be necessary to think about too?
Look, I mean, maybe I'm just operating companies at too small of a scale to influence policy, but I don't have the impression that I have a lot of agency to influence policy. I'm not sure that like even larger companies have that.
Yeah, you do. You do terms of uses. And in those terms of uses, you deny certain customers doing certain things. That's policy. And in most cases, it's quite aligned with laws that exist, not always. So yeah.
Well, I'll give you an example. I mean, when I started the company, Weights and Biases, this is in kind of like a more, kind of woke moment, and AI really had this moment where it was like, hey, we really want to, make sure that we're not like the companies that's like, building bridges for Nazis, right? And like the employees really like cared about it. And we thought, okay, like, we should make sure that like, the uses are ethical. And I think it came from this like, really good place of like, look, I want to, you know, I want to like be a good citizen and serve the world well. And I've actually made enough money for my previous company that it's like not even for me like an economic impact. And then like we got into like all these like gray areas, and I kind of felt like honestly like I just can't even imagine trying to um decide like what I think about um like the Department of Defense applications that we're doing, where they don't even like totally tell you, or like yeah, and some of the most important applications I think are like some of the messiest ones. Like I think like serving U.S. Department of Defense well is something to be like really proud of, not like loving everything they do. I'm sure, and we had enough of these like kind of close ones that we kind of felt like ultimately I think we just have to say that we're gonna like serve the customers that U.S. export law lets us serve, not serve the customers that they don't. And there's not really like another like fair, like sensible way, for us to do it. And that was controversial internally, but I think it actually gave our customers a lot of comfort that like we're not going to like turn on them like some companies had. And I know other companies have like different policies, but it's just like I don't think I was like put on this earth to be like deciding ethics of like particular applications. I really want to make like good tools that are really like what I have to offer, and that's like what the company has to offer. And I think it was a big distraction for us.
So we're out of time, but I mean, I hope folks just got a sense of like, there's like the theory of AI, there's a theory of fast takeoff, there are a bunch of equations that are interesting, but at the bottom of it, it's a bunch of people making hard decisions, right? And small decisions and big decisions that have big consequences. And so thank you for making those, Lukas.
Thanks, James.